Welcome to the ChargePoint podcast, brought to you by FlexiCharge, your gateway to the future of EV charging. In each episode, we dive deep into the world of EV infrastructure, offering insights and perspectives from industry leaders, innovators, and the people at the forefront of deploying charging solutions and networks. Join us to explore the exciting developments that are accelerating our world towards sustainable mobility.
Welcome to a new episode of the ChargePoint podcast. My name is Christophe and I'm your host. Today's episode tackles a topic that's no longer theoretical. It's already reshaping the industry, grid congestion, and what it really means for charging infrastructure. Because here's the reality. Across Europe, the grid is no longer keeping up with electrification. What used to be a background constraint has now become the central bottleneck, delaying projects, limiting capacity, and forcing operators to rethink how they design and scale their sites. And to unpack this, I'm joined by someone who sits right at the intersection of data, infrastructure, and real-world grid operations. Maarten Staats, known for his work with GridCapacityMaps.eu, spends his day at Enexis, one of the leading DSOs in the Netherlands, right in the middle of the Congestion challenge, the biggest one in Europe. Alongside that, he's built one of the most accessible ways to visualize grid capacity across Europe, helping the industry understand where capacity actually exists and where it doesn't. In this conversation, we go beyond the headlines. We break down what grid congestion really is, not just a concept, but as a structural limitation of how our electricity system was designed, and why solutions like flexible connections, smarter allocation, and new operating models are becoming essential. If you're building, operating, or investing in EV charging infrastructure, this is not a nice to understand topic anymore. It's mission critical. Let's get to it. Good morning, Maarten. Welcome to the ChargePoint podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for taking the time. So before we get started with some more details about the topics of today, as always, I'd really like to hear a bit about your origin story. So what led you to the position where you are today and ultimately creating the GridCapacityMaps.eu?
Already for my studies, I worked in the energy transition. I've always been very interested in the big transition. It influences everybody and everything what we do. So that, right. I think that's really interesting to work on this topic. For about 5 years, I've worked on with a grid operator, distribution system operator in the Netherlands called Enexis. And 5 years ago in the Netherlands, there were already a bit of problems on the electricity grid. So we had some transport scarcity problems already. And when starting at Enexis, I used to work on developing these kind of maps. So where do you get data? How do we visualize it? And I didn't know it back then, but the Netherlands was one of the first countries which had these problems. So we kind of had to figure out how do we define these problems? What does it look like? How do you visualize them? How do you talk about them? Then I went on to do a bit of different topics. But in the Netherlands, there was a long time the idea that these problems on the electricity grid are mainly problems for the Netherlands. And at a certain moment, I saw some news article that France also had started or published a grid capacity map. And then I saw a news article about Belgium publishing a grid capacity map. And I thought, okay, well, this is definitely not a Dutch problem. But if these two countries have a map and the Dutch one have, maybe I will just try to see how they compare. And when comparing these, I thought, well, if they have maps, maybe others will have maps as well. And that started a bit of a rabbit hole in trying to find as many maps in Europe as I could. And to my delight, I could find a lot, but it also gives an indication that grid congestion and transport scarcity is really a European problem. It's everywhere. Initially, I just put them on the map, like screenshotted the maps and put them in a picture, and I shared those pictures, and then I saw that got quite some traction. People really got some insight in how big the problem already is. And at a certain moment, I decided that I have a lot of data, a lot of insights. So where to find these maps, what are the links, what do you see on them, what do the colors mean, how do they compare? So I decided to make like an online tool out of it, so everybody could access the material. Also because this was just not available back then. So a lot of grid operators had their own maps, but there was not really a central location where you could find them all, or could really compare them all, or really easily access them as well. So that's why GridCapacityMaps.eu came to be.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I understand. So maybe we can just talk briefly about the company where you're working and where you're employed is Enexis, right? Can you say a few words about Enexis?
The Enexis is one of the three big regional grid operators in the Netherlands. Their area is mostly the southern part of the Netherlands and the northern part of the Netherlands. Within the company, I focus on the impact of the energy transition on our grids, and mainly we try to foresee how many different techniques will be in our grids and when. So how many solar panels and how many electric vehicles and how many heat pumps, and where these new technologies will have an effect on that we go over the limit of our electricity grid. And that is very much connected to the whole congestion and transport scarcity problems we have, because based on these prognoses we make, we try to make sure that the grids don't, there's not too much load on the grid at certain times, and that also means we cannot accept new connections in a lot of our grid area.
Absolutely, yeah. That's. I'm really happy we could have this talk because, yes, as you said, since I've been working for FlexiCharge, I've been really looking at the grid, state of the grid in Europe, and we constantly say that, yeah, Holland is the most challenged market probably in Western Europe for many reasons. Structural reasons, and maybe you can give us just a very short answer. Why is the Dutch grid so much under pressure more than other countries? What are the main reasons?
It's difficult to give one reason, and it's a bit of speculation because I'm not 100% sure, but I think part of those reasons are that certain developments go very fast in the Netherlands, like the amount of solar panels we have is very high compared to other countries. Right. It's also based on policy decisions. So getting solar panels as consumers is really affordable in the Netherlands, because you get a lot of money back for the electricity you put into the grid, or you can take off as much electricity from the grid for the amount you put in. So that is it's a really good scheme for getting more solar panels out there. I think in the Netherlands we also extended that scheme a bit too long. So a lot of people have solar panels now. So it's not necessary to really push the market that much. We also see that the uptake for example, electric vehicles and charging infrastructure in the Netherlands is relatively high. And we are, of course, a bit of a smaller country, so it's easier to traverse with electric vehicles, which might have a little bit lower range than gasoline vehicles. But I think it's also due to that in the Netherlands we are looking a lot towards the future. So we're trying to predict how much of which technology will be in our grids, and we reserve space for technologies which we cannot control anymore. So within current contracts, for example, within a consumer contract, they can often take a charging infrastructure at home, or solar panels, or a heat pump, and they don't need a higher capacity from the grid operator. If they don't need that higher capacity, you need to make sure that the grid can accept these new technologies, because the grid operator cannot prevent them from coming behind the meter. So that means we try to look into the future until the moment the grid is extended, and we reserve space for those new technologies, which also means that how more you expect there to come the coming years, how much more you reserve, the earlier you put a halt to new connections. And I think that's also part of the aspects compared to other countries, that they might not reserve so much space for these technologies as we currently are.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, there's maybe also one historical reason. I just want to proof check it with you. Being half French, I know the French market also quite well, at least from an infrastructure perspective, in the sense that we've been having in France electrical heating for many years. We've been having nuclear, so the cable, the distribution network, the infrastructure on electricity is pretty solid. Where I heard that in Holland, historically, you guys have been warming up your homes with gas. That's the system that's been built, right? So if people were heating the home with gas, that's really a lot of electricity that you don't need to transport. Is there something true in that assumption about the historical buildup?
Yes, that can definitely be one of the aspects as well. So if you have a lot of more electric heating or bigger share of electricity in your energy mix, then you are more likely to have a stronger and more robust electricity system from the start, before we kind of start these energy transition technologies. Then again, you also have higher peak loads because you do heat on electricity. You already have these higher peak loads. So it might be a bit of a balance. You are more likely to have a bit stronger electricity grid, but you also have currently higher peak loads. So in the end, if you look at congestion and transfer scarcity, it's really about the available space you currently have on the grid. And I'm not fully sure if the available space in itself is already much higher in France, or that just the loads are higher. It can also just depend a bit on the country. I know, for example, in France, one of the maps I put in GridCapacityMaps.eu is the maps for batteries, which used to give a pretty good overview of where there was space and where there wasn't. And in a time of about half a year, they just put everything on red, because there are a lot of requests and they cannot connect each request. So that also means that in France, the available space is not unlimited. There's definitely limitations there as well.
Yeah. All right. So let's now dive into the concrete tool here, topic of today. So for those who are unfamiliar, what exactly is GridCapacityMaps.eu and what problem does it solve?
GridCapacityMaps.eu is an overview of capacity maps showing available capacity on the electricity grid within Europe. It is not automatic, so some people think it automatically reads in from each individual grid operator, but it's more or less screenshots showing what does the map look like. So you have an overview of all available maps, but it's mainly a platform where you can find the data and the links to the individual grid operator websites. So especially if you work internationally, you might want to know what locations are more interesting or less interesting, but it can be really difficult to find where all these grid operators show their available capacity. So this is really a platform, a starting point for you to find where you can see what data is available and what tools are available, and quickly access the tools via this platform.
Right.
What it solves is that the fact that it's really hard to find this data. It's not really easy on the websites. It would be really nice if you go to a website of a grid operator and there's a big button on the front page, but it's often difficult to find, especially if you don't speak the language. So it solves the problem of not knowing where to start or where to search. So that gives more time to dive into the data itself instead of trying to find all these resources.
Yeah. So, and how long have you been working on the project?
It's now about a year ago I started on it. So that's the first moment I started searching for different maps. Especially in the first half year, there was a lot of time in finding new data. Then I put a lot of time in building the website. The last few months were a little bit less busy, but the last few weeks I have dived again into it to update the data. And I found that some locations, some grid operators don't show data anymore, and some do show a bit more. So I try to keep it updated with some interval.
Yeah. Why would some grid operator not show the data? I'm curious. Is it really just the lack of time, the lack of, what is it? Are they afraid of something, or lack of transparency between us?
Yeah. Again, a bit of speculation,
yes.
But I know that, or at least I see that some countries like Germany and Sweden, they don't really have these central tools, and they also have a lot of regional grid operators. So Germany has like 800 or something, and
Nightmare.
Sweden has, I think, more than 100. It's really difficult for these rather small grid operators to not only get the data in a good way, make a map, but also make sure that everybody works in the same way.
Yeah.
So I think that is part of why some countries don't show it. You also see some limitation towards the border with Russia. So, for example, the Finland map, they have a really cool map, but it's really difficult to access, probably because they don't want Russian state actors to find it easily.
Yeah.
And also the map of Estonia, they used to have a pretty cool map. They removed it. I don't know for sure, but I can imagine this is also related to security concerns.
Yeah.
And the same with the Berlin map, which disappeared. Of course, Berlin had this big electricity outage because of an attack on the electricity grid, and it might have something to do with that. I didn't find data on it, but it's a pretty good assumption.
It's a good speculation, yeah. Interesting, yeah. That's why, again, this is also why this industry is so exciting, is that it really mixes into geopolitics for good and for bad. But interesting speculation, yeah. Okay, so maybe just stating a bit the obvious, but so why is grid capacity such a critical issue right now for anyone planning EV charging infrastructure?
Yeah, so due to the energy transition, we are going to electrify much more than we used to. So the electricity peak loads are going to increase significantly the coming years. And it also means we need a lot more of electricity infrastructure. We used to build, or at least in the Netherlands, we used to build electricity infrastructure as cost efficient as possible. That means we don't build things we don't expect to be used. That also means we have little available space left on the grid, and you almost always, with big transitions or new technologies, you will need grid extension. You need more grid, more cables, more transformers, and that becomes very fast. That becomes a big bottleneck. However, at the same time, we want to speed up this energy transition. We know we're going slightly slower than what we should. But if the grid can't handle these peak loads, that becomes a big major problem for the new energy technologies on our grids. And also for developers who want to make sure that they can build out their infrastructure. And if you don't know where you can build out, if you don't know when you can build out, that becomes a major critical strategic point, and a lot of uncertainty. And that is why available grid capacity is really important, because then you can build out, but also knowing where there's still capacity or when capacity will be available, so you can plan on it instead of being surprised by the problems.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and to your knowledge, so have you been in talks with CPOs? Do you have practical, relevant examples of how it's being used by network operators?
I haven't done really like consumer analysis on it, but based on the maps I made, I got a lot of interaction with people providing new maps or providing insights into it. It depends a bit on how you want to use it. So sometimes people really just want to know if I request a connection here, will I get it? Yes or no? Mm-hmm. Sometimes certain organizations use it more strategically, like this area is going to have a lot of more capacity. Maybe we try to develop our sales initiatives there a little bit more. It also depends a lot on the country you're in and how detailed the information is there. So I see some differences between those countries. There's one thing that's always the same between all maps. Almost everybody using the maps thinks there should be more information on there. So in the end, there's a lot of interest in the information. And there's a lot of differences between countries on the amount of detail they show.
Yeah, it's interesting. I discussed the same topics many episodes ago. I think it was episode 7 with a consultant from a consultancy agency who's consulting policymakers in Europe, and they were talking about this grid transparency, and that it's for CPOs. It shouldn't be only about looking at mobility data, which is usually what tells you, okay, great traffic, you can have a lot of people coming here. Yes, but then you really need to overlay the grid capacity, because there might be a lot of people in traffic there, but it might be completely congested already, right? So then it's going to be a nightmare. Of course, there are new solutions with batteries, I know, which are also very popular in Holland. But yeah, you still need to know what's the state of the grid. Yeah.
It's definitely another aspect you have to take into account with any energy transition related topic you have. You really need to take into account the limitations the grid have, and I think a lot of organizations are either already moving towards the directions, and those who are not are going to have big problems. And it's a really real change, because about 10 years ago, this was not really a topic. Maybe the cost for the connection was a topic, but not the availability or the timeline of the connection.
Sheer availability, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So can you give a bit of insight? You said that your work on the map is not like every month the same, because it's also it's your side job. So, but what is on your roadmap for the GridCapacityMaps.eu in 26? What improvements, more countries, some features, or what can you tell us?
Well, I try to update it as well, and parallel to my kind of hobby project, which this is, the trade associations of the grid operators in Europe are also working on the topic. So that those are DSO Entity and NSOE. Those are the European grid operators organizations.
Yes.
And they are also working on trying to improve transparency and trying to make them more comparable in the end. Mm-hmm. So I really hope we can kind of work together to further improve this visibility. I can use their platform to add more maps which become available, or get more insight in which map are about to be published. So they published a report in December where it states, for example, that the maps in Sweden and Switzerland are in development. And I would really like to add those, because those are great spots on my map now as well.
Absolutely.
For the tooling aspects, I'm a bit looking for how users use the tool and what they find interesting on it. I would really like to make some sort of overlay where you can see in Europe which countries would be more congested or less congested, like a full European heat map. But based on how the data is currently available, that is really difficult, because for some countries, they only show the available capacity if you click on a single transformer. So that would just take a lot of time to develop and try to get the data myself. So I really hope this data becomes available in a bit more structured or downloadable way. And in the end, I would be really cool to make this kind of heat map of available capacity in Europe. But I still need to figure out how I'm going to solve the data acquiring problem for that.
Yeah. So I guess that was your call to action for DSOs around Europe through the NSOE association, which I hope some are listening, we need to contribute so Maarten can improve the GridCapacityMaps.eu. Any call to action for CPOs? Would you be interested to get in touch with some CPOs, get some feedback on the usage of the map, or what's your message to them?
Maybe a bit more on the call to action to DSOs. I think in the end, I would be very happy if the grid capacity map wasn't necessary anymore, because they improved their available data and their standardization themselves so well that it's not needed anymore.
That's right.
I do this because it's not there. I would be really happy if they figure it out themselves. And I really hope that they try to improve the visibility of the maps. So, for example, use color scales from green to red or white to red or green to white or whatever. At least give an indication, visual indication, which areas have more capacity, in which areas have less. Don't make me click on each individual transformer. I think that I'm not sure why they do this, but I think it's really not necessary, and it really degrades the way you make this information available. So I think that would really be a call to action to the DSOs. The call to action to the CPOs would really be to find these kind of resources and see how they perform, how you use them, and definitely let me know if there's some aspects on the website I can improve. So CPOs or other users can better make use of this available information. And also a call to action would be, if you know of other maps, of other visualizations of available capacity, let me know so I can add them to the website as well.
On that note, thank you very much, Maarten, for taking the time to exchange with me here in the ChargePoint podcast. Thank you for the insight on the GridCapacityMaps.eu. Again, congratulations with this project. I'm not surprised that it's getting a lot of traction. We'll be following the progress and wishing you all the best. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks a lot.
So, what should you take away from this conversation? Well, first, grid congestion is not a temporary issue. It's not something that will be fixed in the next couple of years. It's a structural consequence of how fast electrification is moving compared to how slowly grids can be expanded. Permits, investments, workforce, materials, all of that takes time. Meanwhile, EV adoption and charging demand are growing very fast. Second, the bottleneck is not just about physical capacity. That's a key insight. It's also about how capacity is allocated, forecasted, and protected by grid operators. In many cases, capacity technically exists, but it's not accessible because grids need to manage risk, ensure stability, and plan for contingencies. That's why so many projects get stuck in connection queues or receive less power than expected. Third, this fundamentally changes how charging infrastructure needs to be designed. The old model, grid connection, plug-in chargers, and scale, simply doesn't work anymore. What we're seeing is a growing need to integrate solutions like batteries, smarter load management, and more flexible approaches to grid usage, not as add-ons, but as core elements of site design. And that's really the key learning from today's episode. The constraint is real. It's here to stay, but there are ways to work with it if you understand how the system actually behaves. Conversations like this one with Maarten are critical because they help us move from a very simplified narrative, like the grid is full, to a much more nuanced understanding of why it's happening and what we can actually do about it. If this topic sparked your interest, I strongly recommend you also check out GridCapacityMaps.eu. It's one of the most practical tools out there to visualize real grid capacity constraints and opportunity across regions. And if you found this episode valuable, go one step further and listen to episode 47, where we dive deeper into the solution space, exploring how batteries, flexibility, and smart energy management can unlock charging deployment even under heavy grid constraints, live from the floor at the Interface Benelux conference. Because understanding the problem is step one, and designing the solution, that's where the real game begins. And before we go, if you enjoyed the ChargePoint podcast, don't forget to share it with your network, subscribe so you don't miss upcoming episodes, and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps us to grow and bring more of these conversations to the industry. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.